Quality, energy, and climate change, which was not easy to do in the time period, but we actually made some progress. We tried to respond to three questions that Paul instructed us to. Current state, where things would go if business as usual, but we mostly focused on the recommendations because I think that we all felt that was the most useful for this exercise. So first we start with air quality. Some quite interesting things developed during the discussion. Many of you are aware and involved with developing monitoring stations in the border cities in Mexico over the past 10 years. A rather successful operation, and today there are quite a few monitoring stations on the Mexican side of the border, and the data, as you know, is integrated into the so-called AIRS, AIRS database, so anyone can see the monitoring stations on the Mexican side. However, those stations on the Mexican side are now aging, and they're in need of upgrade and expansion, actually, to other sites. The original funds for those Mexican sites are no longer available. So unless something is done, we are going to begin to lose the data that we've been getting from the Mexican side, and then everything else follows from that. Without good data, it's very hard to make policy. There will be new ozone standards coming in on the U.S. side. That's going to put American cities in non-attainment that may be in attainment now. And to the extent that there's cross-transport, achieving that non-attainment, achieving attainment is going to be even more difficult as the population and the region increases, despite its aging as well. There's still going to be more people. And so the new standards will be a challenge for these are U.S. standards. There probably will be Mexican standards following as well. PM10, PM 2.5 will also be an issue as that becomes more difficult to attain. There's also, if the U.S. standards go into place, which they will, inevitably there will be Mexican standards, but there is a time lag. So right now they're fairly well harmonized, the standards on both sides. If that begins to grow and there's a difference, that's going to be more difficult to have a binational arrangement. So there's, let's see, a question of, oh yes. For many of you who are familiar with air quality issues, most regions are broken up into air basins. But these basins can be quite large, and where the monitoring stations are placed might not necessarily be reflective of the air quality in local micro-regions within the basins, particularly when you have valleys and hills, etc. So for instance, in San Diego, one reason San Diego is out of attainment is because of one monitoring station high up on a mountain, a place called Alpine, which isn't representative of the air in the whole basin. And the same thing in Mexicali. There are one monitoring station is in a region, in a colonia, which is a particular problem with paved roads. That puts the whole region of Mexicali out of attainment on the Mexican side. So there needs to be these hotspots. And when placing the monitors, we need to take into account those hotspots and maybe do more local monitoring to get a better picture of the air quality. Business as usual. If we continue with business as usual, there'll become a greater disparity in the data between the U.S. and Mexico, which will put us back where we were 10, 12 years ago, which would be a terrible pity. The fleet modernization, which is taking place in the U.S. due to federal laws, will continue and likely to lead to improvement in VOCs, volatile organic compounds, hydrocarbons, which of course are the precursors to smog, so that will improve. This is, Bob Curry isn't here, but I can't stand these smiley faces, but he snuck it in there. People are happy.
Was that his note, need new easels, better easels?
Yeah, right. He took off before he had to present this here. So, but it's not clear what's going to happen to NOx, and PMs might improve. So the feeling of the group, and people please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there will be improvement in air quality, but not across the board, and not necessarily in some of these local regions. There will be, one of the reasons there's likely to be a decrease is because of the industrial emissions, particularly in Mexico, and there is still no vehicle inspection program in Mexico, and our Mexican participants suggested that that's a very difficult issue to overcome, and the likelihood of that being implemented is difficult. And so, but there will be an increase in vehicle miles traveled, which will increase the amount of pollutants from the transportation sector. Just so you know, the main source of pollution in most Mexican cities, except a few, are what's called mobile sources: cars, trucks, buses, unpaved roads, and where there's some heavy industry, particularly cement, from fixed sources. Okay, so that's the air. Now we went on to what's to be done. That was business as usual. The same issue comes up over and over again every time this is discussed, that there really is such a thing as an international air basin, that the air, depending on the region and the border, is truly shared across the border. Now, Bob Curry made a good point. He's much more involved in air quality than many of us in the group are. Well, Paul was there too. He's heavily, and so is Jerry. But from a local perspective, he made the point, just designating an international airshed doesn't mean anything. So what? So you designate it, he says, okay, so now there's an international airshed. Unless there's unified airshed management. So I think that's a very good point, that there has to be some teeth that follows from the airshed designation. And he used the example of the Joint Advisory Commission in the El Paso del Norte region. There is an officially designated binational airshed, but there isn't a management plan. That is, there isn't any way to enforce rules and invest in abatement, etc., on both sides of the border. So the jurisdictions do this. So, but we also recognize the classic issue of sovereignty, etc., and it's not going to be possible to actually have a joint enforcement entity. There's, even the IBWC isn't really a joint agency, as we found out here. But there are other ways to get at it. So the jurisdictions could do the same things at the same level or effort, to be defined by each side of the border. So there could be some agreements on what each entity would do, and then they would go about doing it in the way that they know how to do best in their society and the costs. And one thing that could help that would be to allow cross-border investments in air quality pollution. This is something that we've been arguing for a long time, is for offsets to count on the other side of the border. A classic example is there was a power plant built in San Diego called the Otay Mesa Power Plant. Uses natural gas. It's relatively clean, still emits tons and tons of NOx and CO, but it required offsets. And what they did, rather creatively, was to introduce the notion of mobile offsets. Usually you have to take a fixed power plant and reduce it so you can increase more from another fixed source. But they made an agreement to change diesel buses in San Diego to natural gas buses. And the air pollution people countered that. It would have made a lot more sense to take that same investment and convert really dirty diesel buses in Tijuana. They would have gotten a much greater improvement in air quality, but there was no mechanism to do that. The local authorities were totally against that because they claimed, perhaps right, that they had no way to measure those offsets. But if there was airshed management, that could be done. So the reason here is put the money where you get the most improvement for the overall reduction in air pollution.